Have you ever wondered what truly takes place inside a soul at the exact moment when God offers His grace one final time? Have you ever feared, not judgment itself, but the possibility of unconsciously closing your heart to something holy? And have you ever asked yourself what Jesus sees when a soul turns away from the light He pours into its final decisive moment? In the silent depths of her soul, Saint Faustina was shown a truth that was not theoretical, but living, burning, and painfully real, a truth about the grace given at the moment of death. And this truth did not come to her as a dramatic vision or as an imagined scene, but as something she witnessed repeatedly while praying for the dying. She wrote in her diary that in the last moment of life, God grants every soul a ray of powerful grace, an interior light so intense that if the soul desires it, it can return to God in that very instant. But Faustina also recorded something that made her tremble. There are souls who, even illuminated by that grace, voluntarily and consciously reject and despise it. It was this revelation that pierced Faustina more deeply than almost anything she wrote. On certain nights when she prayed for a dying person shown to her interiorly, she felt within her soul the sacred drama unfolding invisibly, the moment when divine mercy visits the soul in silence. Jesus made her understand that outwardly nothing may be visible, no words, no gestures, no signs of repentance, but within, the soul is standing before the greatest encounter of its entire existence. She wrote that sometimes this encounter ends in a sudden and silent return to God, when the soul accepts that extraordinary grace. But other times, and this is the mystery at the heart of this script, the soul rejects the light, not out of ignorance, not because time ran out, but because the soul freely chooses to push away the grace that has come to rescue it. For Faustina, this was not abstract theology. It was a spiritual reality she witnessed with her own senses of the soul. Her joy was knowing that God does absolutely everything, even in the final breath, to bring a soul home. Her sorrow was knowing that the soul remains free to refuse Him. And Jesus made her understand that when a soul rejects this final grace, it enters a kind of inner isolation, a voluntary turning away from God's presence that is no longer imposed, but chosen. Before we go deeper, if you want to understand the real revelations Jesus gave to St. Faustina, nothing invented, everything taken directly from her diary. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. The vision that marked her most was the one where she accompanied a dying man through immense spiritual torment. She saw the struggle of the soul, the powerlessness of the guardian angel, and then the triumph of divine mercy when the soul accepted grace. But in the very same passage, she confessed the horror of souls who reject that interior illumination at the final moment. This is the truth, merciful, terrifying, and profoundly real, that Jesus commanded her to write. When St. Faustina wrote that God grants every dying soul a ray of powerful grace, she was not describing a concept or a theory. She was describing something she saw unfold repeatedly, especially during her mission of praying for the dying. She often sensed interiorly when a soul was approaching that final crossroads, and in those moments, Jesus allowed her to understand the dramatic spiritual reality hidden behind the silence of a deathbed. One evening, after praying the chaplet of divine mercy for an unknown dying person, Faustina felt a sudden interior light, a knowledge not from herself, but given. She understood that at the very instant of death, the soul is flooded with a grace so bright it cuts through every layer of confusion, sin, fear, and weakness. It is a moment of pure clarity, a moment of truth, a moment where God bends down with unimaginable tenderness and offers Himself completely. But, as she wrote, this grace requires one thing, the slightest opening of the heart, just one movement toward God, one whisper of trust, one spark of desire, and the soul is saved. Yet the terror of her revelation remains. Some souls refuse, even illuminated, even seeing the truth. They reject the grace being poured into them. Faustina wrote plainly that the soul is still free, even in that final moment. No one is forced to love God. No one is dragged into mercy against their will. Divine love respects human freedom, even when that freedom wounds the heart that created it. She once wrote in sorrow that when the soul rejects this final grace, the sinner becomes blind and deaf, and of his own will he rejects grace. She felt this truth not as judgment, but as heartbreak. Mercy can come storming into a soul's darkness, but it cannot force an embrace. Jesus offered everything, even at the brink of eternity. Yet some souls turn away from him with full knowledge of what they are refusing. Faustina understood something even more profound. The rejection of grace does not occur in anger or dramatic defiance. It is quiet, interior, a closing of the heart, a refusal to trust, a preference for self over God. She described it as a soul, consciously and voluntarily, pushing the grace away. This is the tragedy she carried in prayer, not that God abandons the soul, but that the soul abandons God even as he reaches for it with infinite love. Yet Faustina never wrote these things to frighten anyone. She wrote them because Jesus wanted the world to know the full truth of divine mercy, that God pursues the soul until the very last breath, that he gives light even in the final seconds, that his mercy is so great, so persistent, so unfathomably tender, that only a deliberate rejection can exclude it. And even then, the rejection is not punished, it is chosen. This is what Jesus revealed to her. This is what she felt burning inside her as she prayed for those who were dying. This is the truth the world must hear. As dawn crept softly across the convent grounds, Faustina carried within her heart the weight of what Jesus had revealed about the final moment of grace. The world around her was still half asleep. Quiet corridors, muted footsteps, a distant bell. Yet inside her soul, there was a storm of understanding. She had seen something that few people ever grasp, the enormous spiritual drama hidden beneath the silence of a dying person's final breath. She remembered clearly one particular grace Jesus gave her. She was praying for an unknown soul in agony, a soul visible only to God. In that moment, she sensed what she described many times in her diary, an inner illumination not of her own mind, but of divine origin. She felt the struggle of the soul as if it were pressing against her own chest, heavy and trembling. She knew the soul was receiving the ray of powerful grace Jesus spoke of, the grace meant to open the heart in one last act of trust. And then, silence, not peace, not surrender, a silence that felt like a closed door. Faustina wrote that there are souls who, at the very moment God pours his greatest mercy into them, turn away by their own will. But she also explained that this rejection is not a simple refusal. It is a mystery of freedom, a mystery of pride, a mystery of a heart that prefers its own darkness to the light suddenly offered to it. Jesus made her feel that this rejection does not happen with words. The dying person does not say, "I refuse." It happens in the hidden depths of the interior, in a movement of the will that only God can see. As she prayed, she understood that the soul either softens under the final ray of grace, or it hardens. She wrote that when the soul rejects grace, something dreadful takes place. The soul becomes isolated within itself. This isolation is not imposed by God, but chosen by the soul that refuses his embrace. It is the spiritual equivalent of turning one's back to the sun and choosing the shadow. It is not a punishment. It is a choice. Faustina saw that when the soul rejects grace at the final moment, its entire interior collapses inward. There is no light, no movement toward God, no desire. Only the chilling freedom to say no to love. Yet even here she emphasized something astonishing. Jesus does not stop offering grace until the very last breath. He continues to surround the soul with rays of mercy, hoping for even the smallest flicker of openness. He does not retreat. He does not abandon. He waits, sometimes until the final beat of the heart, because his mercy longs more for the soul's salvation than the soul itself ever could. This is why Faustina wrote with such urgency. The tragedy is not that God refuses the sinner. The tragedy is that the sinner can refuse God, even at the final breath, even while held in the brilliance of divine grace. Later that afternoon, while the convent settled into its quiet rhythm, Faustina walked slowly through the corridor leading toward the chapel. A soft, pale light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows along the stone floor. Her hands were clasped gently at her waist, and her soul, though calm, carried the deep ache of what Jesus had revealed. She had seen the contrast between acceptance and rejection of grace in a way few ever had. It lived inside her, like two opposing lights, the radiance of divine mercy and the chilling darkness of voluntary refusal. When she entered the chapel, the silence felt warm, almost alive. The sanctuary lamp flickered softly, its flame steady and persistent, like the mercy Jesus pours into every soul. Faustina knelt, lowering her head, and let her spirit sink into prayer. It was there, in that familiar silence, that Jesus allowed her to understand even more about the mysterious instant of the soul's final decision. She felt interiorly how the final grace does not come as a shock or a force. It comes as a light, a clarity that lets the soul see itself truthfully. In the diary, she described this moment as an illumination so strong that the soul recognizes the state of its conscience, its sins, and above all, the tenderness of God calling it home. Yet even in this light, the soul remains free. Faustina understood that when a soul accepts this grace, even in its last breath, it is immediately embraced by God. She witnessed this in the dying person whose agony she described, how divine mercy surged into the soul the moment it turned toward the light. The entire spiritual atmosphere changed in an instant. Peace replaced torment. Hope replaced fear. Grace replaced darkness. But Jesus also let her see the opposite, the moment of rejection. She wrote that some souls consciously and voluntarily turn away from the grace being offered. And in that very instant of refusal, something irreversible happens, not because God withdraws, but because the soul chooses separation. It happens quietly. No thunder, no dramatic cry, just the silent closing of the will. Faustina sensed that this rejection hardens the soul instantly, like water turning to stone. The light that was meant to save becomes the light the soul refuses to enter. And because that final grace is the greatest expression of God's love, rejecting it is not a simple gesture. It is a definitive turning inward, a refusal to be loved. Still, even as she contemplated this tragedy, Faustina felt Jesus surrounding her with his gentleness. He let her know that divine mercy never changes. God never stops offering grace. He never withholds his love. The final moment is not designed for condemnation. It is designed for salvation. The soul's freedom is respected, but mercy fights to the very end. Faustina bowed her head more deeply, feeling both sorrow and hope. She understood why Jesus asked her to write these truths. The world needed to know that no one is lost because God refuses them. A soul is lost only when it refuses him. When evening fell over the convent and the soft hum of daily activity faded into silence, Faustina felt a familiar interior pull drawing her back to the chapel. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing gently against the hallway walls. The air was cooler now. The world felt narrower, more intimate, as if the entire building were holding its breath. She knew Jesus wanted to deepen what he had already revealed about the final battle of the soul. Inside the chapel, the light from the sanctuary lamp glowed warmly, casting a soft halo across the tabernacle door. Faustina knelt, sensing that she was stepping once again into a mystery not of fear but of mercy so profound it nearly broke her heart. The diary had not simply told her that souls reject grace. It had let her feel the weight of that choice, the weight of freedom, the weight of God's aching love. As she prayed, Jesus allowed her to understand that the rejection of grace is not an abrupt event. It is the final expression of a direction the soul has chosen throughout life. In the last moment, grace illuminates everything, yet the soul responds according to what it has allowed itself to desire. The acceptance of that ray of powerful grace is often a single act of trust. The rejection of it is a single act of refusal. But both are decisive. Faustina sensed within her what she had written so clearly. When the soul welcomes that grace, even for the first time in its final breath, God embraces it completely. Nothing stands in the way of mercy. Not sin, not weakness, not fear. The soul simply falls into God like a tired child collapsing into the arms of a loving Father. But when the soul rejects the grace, the movement is entirely different. Jesus allowed her to understand that the soul folds inward, closing its interior like a clenched hand. It rejects not an idea, not a doctrine, but a person. The person who created it, the person who sustains it, the person who, even in the soul's last heartbeat, is offering love so intense that it illuminates the entire interior life. She felt that when the soul rejects the final grace, it becomes spiritually isolated. This isolation is not imposed from outside. It flows from the soul's own decision. Its refusal creates distance instantly, because grace, once rejected, cannot force itself upon the will. Divine mercy respects the freedom it gave. Faustina bowed her head more deeply, understanding the sorrow Jesus feels in that moment. He does not punish the soul. He does not strike it down. He does not withdraw his love. But the soul, having chosen darkness, steps away from the light. And in doing so, it enters a state that she described not with emotional language, but with painful clarity. The soul, voluntarily and consciously, pushes the grace away. Faustina rested in the silence, feeling both grief and awe. Grief for the souls that close themselves, awe for a God who continues offering mercy to the very end. What Jesus showed her was not a threat. It was a revelation of love, a love that follows the soul all the way to its final decision. And that final decision, she realized, is where eternity begins. Night settled fully over the convent, drawing long, quiet shadows across the chapel floor. Only the soft flame of the sanctuary lamp remained awake, trembling gently like a heartbeat in the silence. Faustina stayed kneeling, her hands resting lightly over her habit, her eyes fixed on the tabernacle. She felt that Jesus wanted to complete the revelation he had begun, not with fear, but with truth wrapped in deep tenderness. In the diary, she wrote that divine mercy follows the soul until its final breath, offering a ray of powerful grace that can save it even at the edge of eternity. She also wrote with sorrow that some souls, voluntarily and consciously, reject this grace. Now in the stillness of prayer, Jesus helped her understand why this final moment matters so much. She sensed interiorly that the final grace is like a door opened wide. The soul sees itself clearly, its sins, its pride, its wounds, its entire history, and also sees the tenderness of God reaching for it. This clarity is a gift. It lifts every veil. It cuts through every illusion. It is the full truth wrapped in mercy. But the soul remains free. And this freedom, Jesus made her understand, is the most sacred and the most dangerous gift God has given. Grace can illuminate the soul completely, but it cannot force the soul to love. Even in the final instant, the soul must choose. A simple movement toward God becomes salvation. A movement away becomes separation. Faustina felt this reality not with fear, but with reverence. She wrote that God never abandons the soul, not even then. The final grace is proof. Jesus bends down lower than ever, offering everything he is. Even if the soul has rejected him 1,000 times in life, he comes again, offering mercy once more. A single act of trust is enough. A single whisper of yes is enough. A single desire for God is enough. But when the soul rejects this grace, Faustina sensed the sorrow of that moment. The soul turns inward. It refuses love. It closes itself in a way that no one can break, not even God, because God will not violate the freedom he himself created. She understood that this rejection is not dramatic. It is quiet, hidden, a simple refusal of trust, a preference for self over God. In that refusal, something tragic takes place. The soul steps away from the very light that could save it. It becomes isolated, self-contained, locked within the consequences of its own choice, not punished, free. Faustina bowed her head, overwhelmed not by fear but by the depth of divine mercy. What Jesus showed her was not the harshness of judgment, but the heartbreak of love refused. She realized that hell is not a prison God throws a soul into. It is a door the soul closes from within. She remained in the chapel long after midnight, whispering the prayer that became the anchor of her entire mission. Jesus, I trust in you. Because in the end, that trust, offered in life or in the final breath, is what decides everything.